Hi, I'm Jen Barnes, and you're about to experience how to ditch the old ways of doing things, embrace your neurodivergence, learn tips and tricks to function optimally, and love yourself, neurodivergence and all. Welcome to the Self Loved Woman podcast. Hey, it's Jen. I'm so glad you're here. In today's episode, I'm really excited about this one. We're going to talk about how to improve your focus with ADHD. And it's probably what you think, but more likely than not how you're thinking about it. So this is going to be an awesome conversation. I'm super excited to get into this. And I suspect as soon as I confirm or tell you what it is that we're talking about, you might be tempted to stop listening, right? And I hope you don't. I hope you don't, because this, what we're going to talk about is an evidence-based method. It has been shown to help with improving focus and concentration with ADHD. And it's likely something you have been doing or conceptualizing incorrectly because of how most ADHD coaches, therapists, yoga teachers, meditation teachers talk about it. So we're going to poke some holes in what they may be getting wrong, what we may not be understanding, or what they may not be modifying for ADHD. Because that's the thing. Like, this practice can help lots of people improve their focus and attention and be more present. It's just that it needs to be adapted for ADHD. So I'm I want to just say this is such a powerful practice. I've been doing it since I was 25. Well, officially since I was 25, but probably since I was 16. And it is such a powerful, powerful practice. I would hate for you to miss out on this practice because it's been misunderstood for so long. And you might be like, okay, Jen, what is it? Or maybe you've guessed. Well, it's mindfulness. Now, before you jump off, hear me out. I really want to help you focus better with ADHD. And I can't do that if you stop listening. So by now, you've probably heard mindfulness recommended for focus and concentration, probably ad nauseum. And if you're like me, you maybe even have seen hilariously accurate videos by other ADHD creators beside myself talking about why mindfulness doesn't work. But what they're talking about is when mindfulness is not adapted for ADHD, when it is not modified to work with our ADHD brains. So when I say mindfulness, because of all that, you might be like, oh, hell no, absolutely not. Or maybe even tried it, couldn't get my brain to stop, wasn't calming, thoughts were busy, whatever comes up. And this leads us to mindfulness myth number one. Somehow it got out into the world that mindfulness requires you to sit there silently on a meditation cushion, calming your mind and clearing your thoughts. And I don't know, maybe someone like the Dalai Lama can do that. That is just not realistic for anyone, especially not for the ADHD brain. And here's why. Our brains are designed to think. They're like, that's what they do, is they're designed to think. And if you have an ADHD brain like I do, they think very, very quickly. So we're not trying to turn off the thoughts. That's not even the point. What we're trying to do is choose something to focus on, which may be a movement you're doing. It might be your breath. It might be a candle. It might be brushing your teeth. It doesn't have to be this big thing. It might be a saying or a mantra that you're saying. The intention is to attempt to focus on that thing that you've decided to focus on. And then when your brain goes off topic or off, not topic, but off of focus, you notice it and you go, oh we're focusing on this thing. You bring it back over and over and over again. And here's the deal. Sometimes with ADHD, you won't even notice it until you're done practicing the mindfulness and you go, oh my gosh, I just sat there and thought about Bones the entire time. Sorry, I'm rewatching Bones with Temperance Brennan and Celie Booth and the whole crew at the Jeffersonian. Anyway, so, I'll be like, oh, wow, I thought a lot about Bones, or, ooh, thought a lot about my business, got some great ideas. That's great. Thank you, universe. Or you might be like, oh, great. I just worried about my kids for that whole time. Whatever it is, it's okay. As soon as you notice that you got distracted from your object of your mindfulness practice, then you go, oh, yeah, I'm going to bring my attention back. So even if it's a day and a half later, you go, oh, yeah, I'm going to bring my attention back. And you just do that for a moment, even just to start to train your brain that when you have decided to practice mindfulness, that the intention is to bring your attention back. This is actually necessary to get the benefits that we're talking about. If you were able to just sit there or, I don't know, mindfulness while you're running or doing yoga, whatever it is that you're practicing mindfulness, and we'll get to more of that later. If you were just able to do that without losing focus, first of all, you wouldn't need what I'm talking about. But second of all, you wouldn't be able to improve your focus because it's already good, but also to improve your focus, you have to bring it back over and over. It's like basically if we're going to build your biceps and you're going to do curls, right? And so you do curls and then you rest, you do curls and then you rest. And it would just be like, yeah, my biceps are so awesome. Curls aren't going to do anything for me anymore. Or I don't know. It's a bad example, but, but it's part of the practice is that your brain will be busy. And then you just notice that. And I am going to talk about if you have a trauma history. I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in the episode, because if you do have a complex trauma history, and I know we've talked about ADHD and trauma, then there may be some additional things that you're going to want to do to create some psychological safety inside of a mindfulness practice. So we'll chat about that a little later. But for most of us, our thoughts are just busy. They're not going to harm us. And so the whole thing with mindfulness is getting distracted, noticing you're distracted, and bringing your attention back. So hopefully that puts you at ease so that you're not like, I can't do it because my brain is busy, or I can't do it because I can't stay focused. Well, the point isn't to stay focused. The point is to notice when you're not focused and then to get focused again, like bring it back. I'll tell you, I was at a ADHD workshop. I can't remember the guy's name now. It was a really good one on the neuroscience of the ADHD brain. And then it talked about interventions. And he didn't mention the word mindfulness, but he talked about training your brain when you get distracted to bring it back. And basically, he was talking about a mindfulness practice. So it's certainly evidence based. And I want to talk about that too. There is a lot of evidence out there for how well mindfulness works for everybody, but specifically for ADHD. So with ADHD, they've done studies. One of them was at UCLA, was a pretty landmark study. And they found that after they did like for 8 weeks, weekly mindfulness, it sounded like a group practice. I'm not really sure how that went. And then they had the people start doing a daily mindfulness practice, starting with 5 minutes and working up to 15 minutes over 8 weeks. And that after that 8 weeks, they were already better at attending to tasks, to directing and maintaining their focus. So just 8 weeks. And I remember reading a study. I can't cite my source because this was like, oh, geez, the early aughts, like maybe 2004, maybe 2006, that they showed that the part of the brain that is responsible for attention and focus actually grows in meditators. And they found this in novice meditators too, not just experienced ones, but people they started meditating with the study, and 12 weeks in, they already saw that part of the brain start to change. And that's really congruent with some of what that study out of UCLA found, is that there's also evidence that the prefrontal cortex, the part where your executive functioning happens, right? If you think of the prefrontal cortex, I'm touching my forehead, although you can't see a video. So the prefrontal cortex is the front part of your brain. It's the part of your brain that only primates have. So we have it orangutans, monkeys, gorillas, we all have the prefrontal cortex. And obviously, ours is much more developed. This is what, if you think of the CEO of the brain, so it directs functioning, it's in charge. And that's where the executive functioning is. And ADHD, as we know, when you have ADHD, you have challenges with executive functioning. And that's because of some of the differences in our prefrontal cortex. So when you practice mindfulness, you're actually rewiring and changing your prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain that does the executive functioning, which is something that ADHDers have a hard time with. So to me, it's like no brainer. And I hear a part of you going, "Ah, but it's so hard." And I want to validate that. Like, I get it. It can be scary to start practicing mindfulness, especially if you've not been doing it the way that is good for ADHD, or not good, but like a better fit for ADHD. But also, if you go in thinking like, "Oh, it's gotta be this big whole thing," whereas if you're just like, "Oh, I'm gonna do a little bit here, I'm gonna do a little bit there," it's quite an amazing thing. So, all right, to that end, I wanna talk about another very common myth about mindfulness, because I want you to pause for a moment, and when I say mindfulness or mindfulness meditation, what comes to mind? If you're like most people, you probably are picturing someone sitting cross-legged on a meditation cushion. And that can be a way to practice mindfulness, but that is not the only way to practice mindfulness. In fact, with ADHD, I actually recommend not doing a seated practice, especially not right away. I know I certainly didn't. It's just, and sitting quietly. Oh my gosh. No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. So I want to talk about this because that expectation we create in our mind, that picture that we create our mind is false. That's not accurate. That's not what we're talking about. There may be some people, maybe neurotypical folks who aren't super stressed out in this world, which I don't know anyone like that. Well, I mostly know women. So there's that. Maybe there's some fellas out there who have wives to take care of their house and all they do is work. So maybe their life is less stressful. So maybe they can. But most of the women I know tend to be super overloaded and stressed. And so even if they don't have ADHD, sitting quietly on a meditation cushion and expecting their brain to be quiet, which again, remember, not mindfulness practice, but is just out of reach for so many. And I want to tell you, I want to back up as I share this with you. I started mindfulness with movement, and I didn't even know I was really doing it. But I was a runner. I started running when I was 16. I didn't run regularly. Well, I ran regularly, but only like 2 or 3 days a week because I was also in dance, and by then I had quit softball, but I was also doing other activities. I was cheerleading. Help me. Anyway, so I had other physical activity I was doing, but on some of the other days, I would just go for like a little mile and a half run around Como Lake, if you're from Minnesota, in St. Paul. It's where I grew up, just a few blocks away from there. And so I'd go for a run around the lake, and that was great. And what I didn't realize is I was practicing mindfulness, because I would notice my breath and I would try and time my breath and my steps. I don't know why I thought to do that. I certainly didn't have anyone teach me how to run like properly, if there's a proper way, or efficiently. But that's just something I figured out. And I noticed myself being focused on my breath. And I would get distracted in my thoughts. And then I'd be like, oh, yeah, okay. And sometimes, man, the amazing processing that you do when you're on a run. I don't run anymore, but man, that was some really good processing time that I didn't know I needed, but totally did. But a lot of times I was practicing mindfulness, because when I'd get distracted from my breath, I'd bring it back over and over. And then if you fast forward to when I started therapy when I was 25 or 20, almost 25, my therapist wanted me to practice mindfulness. And she had me start with when I was running. And then I branched out. And when I would teach indoor cycling classes or even take them, although I mostly just taught them, I would have some of the class be focused on mindfulness. I'd put a song on that was still pumped up, but it was instrumental. And so it gave space for people to be with their body on the bike and to notice the ball of their foot, well, through the shoe, hit the metal part of the pedal and push down, feeling their quadricep muscles. And then as they pulled up, feeling their heel pull up, engaging their hamstrings and all around and noticing their breath, right? And then every time they got distracted from that, they would just notice, oh, yeah, I'm thinking about something else. I'm going to refocus on the pedal stroke. And that was mindfulness. And doing that, starting with movement, first of all, helped my focus so much that by the time I was 29 and I went for an ADHD assessment, I was told I coped too well with all of my skills and that my attention, my ability to focus or challenges with focusing rather were subclinical because of my meditation practice, my mindfulness practice. So this stuff really works, people. I mean, there's research out there, but I'm a living example of it. One of the things that you might know about me is I don't ever recommend anything I haven't done myself or wouldn't do if I was in that same situation. Meaning, I had some clients in the past who had schizophrenia, and I would recommend things for them, which I am free of that disorder, so I did not need to do those things. But generally speaking, I don't recommend something I haven't done myself or wouldn't do in a similar situation. So with this, it was like, wow, this really is making a difference. And somewhere in there, I did start a seated practice. And it was hard. I could do like 1 to 5 minutes max, but it was enough. You can also do mindfulness meditation with toothbrushing, which sounds kind of silly, but there's so much to be mindful of as you're brushing each and every tooth. You can taste the toothpaste. You can feel it shift from being more creamy to foamy. You can feel it dribble down the side of your mouth or onto your face. Unless you're a clean toothbrusher, then you won't notice that. But you can be present with that experience. And what? That's 3 minutes max, maybe 5 if you're take your time. But that is another amazing way to introduce mindfulness into your practice. Also, back then, I was reading a lot of Thich Nhat Hanh and other Buddhist authors. And I remember Thich Nhat Hanh talking about, are you washing the dishes to wash the dishes? Or are you washing the dishes to get them clean? Because if you're washing the dishes to get them clean, then you're not focused on the dishes. You're focused on that cup of tea you're going to have afterwards. But then when you're drinking your cup of tea, what are you focused on? Are you really present and enjoying it? And so what he was talking about, and I'm paraphrasing what he said, he had much more beautiful language around it. But basically, bottom line is if you are not present when you're washing the dishes, if you're not appreciating the smell of the soap and feeling the water, then those are moments that you're not present, you're not aware. And you might be okay with that. You might be like, Jen, I hate dishes. There's no way I want to be present. When I wash the dishes, I just want to get over with. And that's fine. And it's an easy way to practice mindfulness. Now, I don't have a dishwasher, so that's an opportunity for me to practice mindfulness. If you've got a dishwasher, it might be a whole different story. But this doesn't have to be you setting up an altar and getting a Zafu meditation cushion and all those kinds of things. It could be if you want to, and I can talk a little bit about what my practice has evolved into. But I would recommend if you're starting with mindfulness that you start with some kind of movement and perhaps starting with something you're already doing and just bringing your attention to it, noticing when you get distracted and bringing it back. Because in doing that, you are training your brain to be able to decide what to focus on and to sustain that focus. And the important piece is not to shame yourself because remember, every time you get distracted, it's like, oh, whoops a daisies. I was supposed to be thinking about this. Bring it back. Even if it's hours afterwards, it's still teaching you to bring your attention back. So there's lots of little ways you can find to practice mindfulness that's going to help your focus and attention. I want to talk specifically about a way that I found, well, it found me when I was in my 30s. So when I was about 35, I started practicing yoga and not because I really wanted to. I was a bodybuilder at the time. I was a group fitness instructor teaching like sports conditioning and kickboxing and spinning and all that. So, sorry, when I say spinning, I always hear David on Schitt's Creek talk about it's like I was a spin instructor or something, and he's talking about that being a bad thing, and so I always giggle in my head. So anyway, back on the rails. But yoga found me. Yoga found me through an old boyfriend at the time, kind of not really dragging me, but he's like, "You should go to yoga." And my gosh, he was right. I needed yoga. There was a time after I've been practicing yoga about 5 years, my mom was like, "You can never stop doing yoga." And I think some of it was it calmed me down. It helped me be present enough. It was a mindfulness practice so that I was less scattered and I wasn't so unfocused that I couldn't hold a conversation with someone who wasn't ADHD. And not that I mean, I kinda did it. I could do conversation, but it was a lot of work. But after practicing yoga for a while, not realizing it was another form of mindfulness at the time, I greatly improved my ability to focus and pay attention. And it doesn't just have to be yoga, it can be other movement based practices like Tai Chi, I'm sure Qigong. Could even do it with Pilates or I know weightlifting. I used to do mindful weightlifting for a while. The added benefit of yoga is there is some, what shall I say, movement that eventually invites in stillness. So usually after a yoga practice or tai chi, I don't know about qigong, I've never done it. You feel less pumped up and more chill. Whereas after lifting weights or running, well, running sometimes I'd feel less pumped up because I'd be tired because I would run 6 miles. But after weightlifting, I didn't necessarily feel more at ease or soothed. I may have been more focused, but I was probably more intense, not less. And certainly running could do that to me too if I ran too many times a week. Once I started yoga, I was really aware of, ooh, this kind of amps me up. It increases my anxiety and just other things, which there's a whole nervous system conversation to have there another time. But you get the idea. So I want to say another option for you is to try some of those practices yoga, tai chi, qigong. I'm sure even any kind of martial art because you're breathing with movement. So that can help you be present and attentive because that's really what being able to direct your focus does is brings you into the present moment. Now, while I have these other ways of being mindful throughout the day, and I do practice mindfulness in them, I also have a seated meditation practice, and it's basically a mindfulness practice. There's lots of kinds of meditation. The way I practice meditation is very mindfulness based. And I start with, well, actually, before I talk about the mantra, I actually start with something called alternate nostril breathing. And you can Google that. I'm not going to explain the whole thing here, except to say that start with your left nostril if you tend towards anxiety. So if you tend towards depression, you can do it the regular way, starting with your right nostril. But alternate nostril breathing is actually a balancing breath. And I find that it settles me enough to be able to do the mindfulness meditation that I'm about to do. So after I do Nadi Shodhana, alternate nostril breathing, then I go into a mantra meditation. I do some meditation with the breath after I finish the mantra. So I usually meditate for about 12 minutes. I will say the mantra that I have usually takes about 8. That includes Nadi Shodhana. That includes alternate nostril breathing. So actually the mantra alone probably takes 6 minutes. And so the way that I learned to meditate with mantra is to use what's called a mala. And if you're seeing a video of any of these on social media, because my VAs take reels and post them there, you'll notice that I'm wearing a mala in our video. And not a yeah, a mala is basically it looks like a necklace. There are 108 beads on it, plus a guru bead. So the guru bead is the bead at the bottom. Sometimes there's a tassel. My tassel fell off of this one and it's still quite pretty. But the guru bead is the one you don't chant on that one. It holds the energy of the mala. And so usually you use one mala for the same mantra. So I have multiple malas that I use different mantras, but I tend to use the same mantra more days than not, which for me is a mantra to Tara, the goddess Tara. It doesn't have to be that your mantra is anything that is to a goddess or a god. You could chant something in English like peace, 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 or breathe in peace, breathe out love, or something like that on each bead. It doesn't have to be anything big. I will tell you a popular one is Om Mani Padme Om. And you can look at on YouTube. There's lots of Om Mani Padme Om mantra videos that you could hear how it's done. That's not one I chant, so I actually don't know kind of the tune to it. One you can do that just means peace is Om Shanti Om, and that just sounds like Om Shanti Om Shanti Om, and that's one round, and each bead gets that, and then you go around 108 times, and I share this. This is a little more than I usually share on a podcast. This is usually like paid programming, so there you go. But I suppose you could Google this if you wanted to, so there you go. But anyway, when you chant on a mala using your mantra, you will end up saying it 108 times. And here's what's going to happen. Your brain's going to get distracted. In fact, it's interesting. Your mouth can say the mantra and your brain is thinking about something else, especially if you've been doing it a while and you don't have to think about the mantra as much anymore. So my mantra, Om Tara, Ture Swaha, my mouth knows how to say without my brain thinking about it. So for me, it truly is a meditation practice because as I say the mantra or whisper it, because eventually you get to whispering, you can start saying it and then you whisper. Anyway, sometimes it can be in your mind eventually, but as you do that, you may be able to think about something else. So when you do, you notice that and you bring your attention back to the mantra. So that is one kind of meditation that you can practice that I find very useful with ADHD, if that aligns with the way that you want to be in the world. And if you're like, Jen, all that mantra stuff is not a fit for my spirituality, or some of you might have a religion that you practice and that might not be a fit for you. Maybe there's a prayer. Certainly, I grew up Catholic and I don't identify as that now. I more identify as a recovering Catholic, but we used to have a rosary, which that's probably why I like mantra meditation because it feels so similar to that. Although, to be honest, I don't really know how many times I prayed the rosary by myself. But we would pray. If you're not familiar with a rosary, if you didn't grow up Catholic and aren't familiar, it basically looks almost exactly the same as a mala, except that it's grouped into 5 groups of 10 beads with the chain in between those groups and a bead in between. And then there's a cross on the end with 3 beads right by it. And so each of the beads gets a different prayer. And the 3 prayers that are said are Hail Mary, and they get the 10 beads. The Lord's Prayer or Our Father gets 1, and then the Glory Be, I think, gets the 3. I could be wrong. Anyway, but my point is that was mantra meditation, and I just didn't know it. So you don't have to be spiritual in the same way I am to practice mantra. It could really be whatever you want, but it's really a nice way. It's a segue into seated practice, or it can be your whole seated practice so that you're not just sitting there with your brain and not having anything to focus on. I will say, after I do my mantra, I will sit and breathe and focus on the breath and moving light up and down the central channel of my spine. Though I do use another mantra, which is Soham or Soham. Some people call it Hamsa. I prefer Soham. I inhale So, exhale Hum. Some people inhale Hum, exhale So. But what it means is that I am that I am, and basically recognizes that we are one with spirit, all of us. So that's a nice little mantra that you could do. You could even do that one on your mala. So that's where my seated practice is now. The other thing I will tell you if you're looking to develop more of a seated practice is do it in the same place every time. And maybe have some kind of environmental trigger that reminds you that that's what you're doing. So I've moved several times in my adult life. And when I say several, it's probably like in the last 20 years, I've moved between 6 and 8 times, including a move to Colorado and back home to Minnesota. So I've moved a lot in my life. But one thing I've always had is when I started my seated practice is a meditation cushion, and I created a little altar. And the word altar doesn't have to be scary. It can just be whatever you want. On my altar, I have a picture of my mom and I have her ashes. I have a different little things like a rock one of my friends gave me and a rock I found on a hike with another friend and pictures of my cats who have crossed the rainbow bridge. I also have some mortis, which are little statues of gods and goddesses. You could when I was Catholic, I probably would have had a picture of Mary. It doesn't have to be anything big. You could have a picture of your family there. But I find that having that kind of spiritually charged space for me reminds me my brain, my body, the whole situation because they're connected that now is the time. Now is the time for this practice. And it kind of helps ground you in it. And speaking of grounding, the other thing I do, and this is great if you're going to do a seated practice, is I have a circle of rocks around me. So I just got them when I was on a hike in Colorado. I lived there, rocks were plentiful. And yes, it was a hard hike back because I had all these rocks. I should have spread it out. And they're not huge rocks, but they're just little rocks. I have 9 of them and I put them around me. And it's just a way to help ground the energy because we can get fairly ungrounded with ADHD, and having the earth element around us can really help. So, those are some tips to help you if you decide to do a seated practice. But again, mindfulness can be moving. Mindfulness doesn't have to be quiet. You can be saying a mantra. It's just a matter of focusing on something, saying, I'm going to focus on this. Whoopsies, I got distracted, and bringing your attention back. Heck, you could practice mindfulness when you're working. You could be, actually, I kind of did that this morning. I am switching my virtual assistants. And when I was getting some of the things ready, some of the documents, and I was doing it, I got distracted on something else. I was like, nope, nope, we're focusing on this. Right? Every time you do that, you're practicing mindfulness. So this is a really simple thing. And like Jog Kabat-Zinn said, he's the guy who developed mindfulness-based stress reduction, which is a big program. It's awesome. I don't know how many people have gone through it, probably hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions. I don't know. It's a really popular program, but it is basically what he says is mindfulness is simple, but may not always be easy. So I'm not offering this to you in this way to say, like, it's pretty easy, just it's fine when your thoughts come up. No, it's simple, but that doesn't mean it's not going to be challenging. And what I'm going to tell you is this. If you want things to change with your brain, you may have to do some uncomfortable things. If you want to be able to focus better, you may have to do uncomfortable things. If you want to be able to get stuff done, focus and prioritize with your ADHD brain, you may have to do some uncomfortable things, maybe even hard things. And so this could be one of them. This could be one of them. Okay. I was going to share about another study, but I'll just leave it at this, that I found several studies because I was looking for this episode specifically. I've seen them before, but I found several the National Institute of Health, NIH, has done on mindfulness with ADHD, and they show all of this stuff. Of course, they say they need to do more rigorous studies as part of the kind of outgoing comments, but that tends to be common. But what I will also leave you with is this. I'm going to forget her last name, but her first name is Sarah, and she's out in Boston. I want to say she might even be at Harvard, but she's a researcher and she researches the impact of meditation on the brain. And she found one of the parts of the brain that's also impacted, in addition to the stuff we've been talking about, is the insula. And the insula is what we consider the eye maker. It helps with a sense of identity. It helps with a sense of connecting with yourself. And that's really important because it helps you be present, and it helps you with clarity around who you are and to get connected with those deeper levels of who you are. And I got to tell you, yeah, the attention and focus stuff is beautiful. But if there is Lazar, it's Sarah Lazar, by the way. Sorry. I knew it would come to me. But while the attention and focus stuff is lovely and super helpful, I got to tell you, having a deeper connection to yourself and self-awareness seems like even more important and more beautiful and lovely. That's all I have for you today. Hopefully you stuck it out and are still here. And I'd love if you'd comment. And if you're like, I still don't think I can do that, Jen, I'd like you to try. I'd like you to try. That's your mission if you choose to accept it. Try some of the things we talked about. And oh my gosh, before we go, I forgot to mention the trauma sensitive piece. So here we go. I was ready to wrap, and I do want to make sure we get to this. We talk a lot about trauma on the Self Love Woman Way podcast, trauma and ADHD, and even the trauma of growing up ADHD and all the criticism and correction and negative commentary. And if you have a trauma history, especially a complex trauma history, sometimes sitting to meditate or do mindfulness can feel super overwhelming. And so it's important that you do trauma sensitive practices. You may find that you can do yoga, practice yoga, and that feels okay. But what I would recommend is that you understand that you have a choice when you practice yoga, even if you're in a public class and not practicing a trauma sensitive specific class. You get to make choices. And if the teacher doesn't allow you to make choices, I suggest you roll up your mat and leave because that's a choice too. And you get to have sovereignty over your own body and your own experience. And if you are choosing to do a seated practice or some other mindfulness practice, one way you can make it trauma sensitive is to notice your window of tolerance, is to notice when you are either shut down or in your fight or flight. And in between that is your window of tolerance. And if you notice you're bumping out of that, stop the practice for a moment. If your eyes were closed, open them. Maybe do something like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. You can look up what that is, but it's basically noticing stuff with your senses in your environment. You could stop the practice entirely then. You could practice volcano breathing, which we talk about a lot here, which is putting your hands together in front of your heart. As you breathe in, you lift your arms up overhead. As you breathe out, you bring them down around by your side and back to center. You could do that a few times and then try again, or you might be done that day. But it's important, if you do have a trauma history, that you are adapting your mindfulness practices to honor your trauma rather than forcing it on yourself. Because otherwise, it's just going to feel like you're re-traumatizing yourself doing something that doesn't feel like a fit. So I teach about that in my program. That's a whole deep dive topic, but I did want to make sure that we touch on that so that you're aware that if you do have a trauma history, you may need to do something a little different to honor that in yourself so that you're not getting flooded if you do a seated practice. So if that's the case, I actually recommend you also start with some of the movement-based practices we've been talking about, whether that's going for a walk or run or yoga, tai chi, qigong, those kind of things. So, all right, y'all, now I feel ready. Now I feel complete with what I wanted to say today. It's been great having you here. Thank you for listening if you stuck it out. And if you're not following it already, be sure to follow. I'd love it if you'd comment, even if you're like, Jen, this is bullshit. Feel free to comment. I really want to interact with you. You're welcome to also hit reply to the email if you get the email, or comment on social media if you see the reels posted there about it. So, all right. Hope you are doing well and take care. If you're not already, be sure to share and follow the Self Loved Woman Way podcast. See you next time.